She lay in the heart of a snow-covered forest, blood seeping through her clothes. Her frail hands clutched tightly around her stomach, as if holding on to the last flicker of life. No one knew who she was. No one stopped. Until a man dismounted his horse, knelt down, pressed his ear to her chest, and whispered, "I'm not leaving you here. She's still alive?" The man's voice was hoarse, reverberating through the dense forest like a growl from winter itself. Another figure stepped closer, peered down at the bruised body curled beneath the tree, blood staining the snow beneath her. Snow fell without sound, but each flake on bare skin felt like a slap. Sharp, cold, drowning out the last of her resistance. Elena Ward, 22. Once dreamed of being a small-town schoolteacher nestled in the mountains, now reduced to a broken shell lying in the snow. Her eyes could no longer open. Her trembling hands tried to cradle her belly, where the pain pulsed like a spring ready to burst. Snow filled her collar, melted into icy water that ran down her spine. A pair of black boots stopped near her head. The man smirked, a slightly bent iron rod in his hand. Blood still clung to the metal. "This is mercy," he muttered. "She betrayed us, and we let her live." Another man tossed a red coat over her, not for warmth, but to cover what they had done, to cover the mess, to cover what remained of their conscience. Then came footsteps, growing fainter, until they dissolved into the wind that sliced through the woods. No one looked back. The snow kept falling. No one knew who the girl was. No one knew that she had lived in a little mountain town, where everyone believed they knew everything about everyone. No one knew that the name Elena Ward, gentle, soft-spoken, now belonged to the trembling figure discarded in the wild. She didn't die, but her life clung to scraps of fading memories. Her mother's lullaby, her father's hesitant eyes when he couldn't stand up for her against Judith, and the old blackboard where she once taught kids their first letters. They used to call her Miss Light. Now, only darkness remained. Miles away in the woods, the sound of hooves echoed over the frozen ground. A grey stallion raised its head, sniffing the air. Its rider, a tall man in his 40s, wearing a moss-colored wool coat, halted before a broken tree limb lying across the trail. He didn't look lost, yet he had no destination. Lucien Grayson, 38, once a magnate of construction, had built an empire across New England. A man the press once dubbed the millionaire who never spoke. That face, once on finance magazine covers, was now unreadable, closed off. Lucien wasn't out hunting. He was running, from a sound that haunted him every night. The laugh of a child who would never return. His horse stopped. Something didn't sit right. A mound of snow. No, a person. A woman in red, brown hair, barely breathing. He didn't ask, didn't say, "Are you all right?" Didn't call for help. He simply jumped down, knelt, and pressed his ear to her chest. Breathing, faint. But there. Elena opened her eyes just a little, and through the wind she heard a sentence, not a question, a promise. "I won't leave you behind." The fireplace in the wooden cabin fought to stay lit. The wood was damp, old, reluctant to burn. Thin coils of smoke stung the tired eyes of Maggie Dawson, the elderly housekeeper who had lived with Lucien for nearly a decade. Hunched over, she coaxed the fire with the last scraps of dry wood from the basket, muttering familiar words under her breath, like charms for comfort. It had been 7 years since a stranger last crossed this threshold, and now, lying curled on the settee near the fire, a young woman, drenched in dried blood and melted snow, lay silent as a ghost, lost in the wrong world. "Where did you find her?" Maggie asked quietly, her voice unusually gentle, but edged with the caution of someone who had seen too much. "In the woods," Lucien replied, his tone low. He sat unmoving, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the girl's still form. Maggie exhaled and pulled a thicker blanket over the girl. When her hand touched Elena's forehead, she flinched, cold as stone. "She's skin and bones," Maggie whispered, pity softening her voice. She took off her gloves, dipped a clean cloth into warm water, and began wiping the girl's face. Her movements were slow, careful, as if afraid a single wrong touch might worsen the bruises and cuts beneath the dirt and dried blood. Old wounds emerged, not fresh, repeated. Elena flinched as the cloth grazed her cheek, a reflex like her body no longer knew how to believe in kindness. Lucien watched in silence. His hands were still stained with her blood, blood that bore the weight of a truth no one dared to name. And because of it, he couldn't walk away. After some warm water, damp cloths, and a small dose of fever medicine, Maggie gently patted Elena's hand, adjusted the blanket, and stepped back. "Rest now, child," she whispered. "No one will hurt you here." And Elena slipped into sleep. It wasn't deep, more like a door shut loosely against the storm behind it. But soon, the crackle of the fire seemed to pull her back. She jolted awake. Sweat soaked her back, and the warm blanket felt suddenly like a net. Her breath came in short bursts, eyes darting around the wooden room, one she didn't remember entering. A door creaked open. The scent of herbal tea drifted in. Maggie was in the kitchen, brewing tea like a mother tending to a sick child. By the fireplace, Lucien still sat, unmoving. His gaze softened when she opened her eyes, but he didn't approach, as if knowing the space she needed to feel safe. Elena shrank back, clutching the blanket to her chin, voice rough, wary. "Who are you?" Lucien didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes steady, without demand. Only presence, only quiet assurance. "I was passing through the woods," he finally said, "and you were someone I couldn't walk away from." Her brow furrowed. Her eyes, still wet, still full of fear, narrowed. "Are you one of them?" This time, Lucien bowed his head slightly. His voice was low, calm, and didn't try to prove anything. It simply carried the weight of a man who had already lost too much. "I once let someone I loved slip away, and it burns me every day. If I ever get a second chance, I won't let anyone else be left behind." Elena didn't reply, but somewhere in the tight coil of fear within her chest, something loosened. Just a little. Enough for her to breathe. Enough to release the blanket. Her hands trembled, but for the first time, she pushed herself up, sitting upright, as if her body, before her mind, had begun to believe. Maybe this time, she wouldn't be hurt. After 2 days of rest, Elena was finally able to step out of her room on her own. Her eyes still held a trace of sadness, but her complexion had improved. She sat by the window, hands wrapped around a warm cup of ginger tea that Maggie had just made. The gentle, spicy aroma lingered in her throat, chasing away the lingering chill of that forest night. The wooden kitchen grew cozy with the scent of butter-sautéed onions and slow-stewed carrots. Maggie, the elderly housekeeper who had lived with Lucien for nearly a decade, was tasting the soup with a chipped wooden spoon. She stirred it gently, glancing sideways at Eleanor, who had quietly walked in, still cradling her half-finished tea. "I made something easy to eat. Just carrots and potatoes. No bitterness, no spice, no nightmares." Elena didn't reply, but she pulled out a chair and sat at the table, eyes fixed on the tray of soup and the slice of toast with its edges slightly burnt. It was a small gesture, but enough to make Maggie pause for the briefest moment before she resumed stirring the pot. Expression calm, as though she hadn't noticed the shift. "You're the first person to walk into this kitchen besides me and the master. In 10 years. Still, Eleanor said nothing. She simply picked up the spoon and took a bite. For the first time since she'd arrived, she finished the entire bowl. As the afternoon faded, Maggie wiped the table and went out to the garden to cut fresh mint. Lucien stepped into the kitchen, a heat pad and a bottle of ointment in his hands. He meant to set them down beside Eleanor, but as he reached out, she flinched. Her body jerked away, hitting the chair hard, and the spoon clattered to the floor. Elena was breathing fast, her face drained of color. Lucien stood frozen for a moment. Then, slowly, he bent down and picked up the spoon. His eyes never left her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to get that close." She didn't answer, but her whole body was tense, strung tight like a wire. Her eyes were wild, not because of him, but because of something deeper. Lucien stepped back. He took a seat across from her, leaving space. "I don't know who did that to you, but I do know. Fear like that doesn't come from just one time." Elena bit her lip. She nodded, not in confirmation, but in quiet recognition of the truth in his words. A moment passed in silence, but in that silence, the untold became understood. "I used to want to be a teacher," Elena said eventually, her voice calm but slow, like she had just found the strength to say it aloud. Lucien was about to lift his cup of tea but paused. He didn't move closer. He just leaned against the wooden beam, voice steady, like he was sharing an old story. "My daughter used to say that too. She'd teach her teddy bears the alphabet, A, B, C, but she gave up at D, said she hated it, because D stood for divorce." Elena tilted her head, surprised. "Her mother left when she was too young to understand," Lucien went on, unflinching. "I failed at keeping our family together, and when I finally had the chance to make it right, an accident took her from me." He gave a quiet smile, not joyful, but a bitter curl of the lips. "That was the last time I ever heard her say any letter of the alphabet." Elena didn't speak right away, but her gaze softened. She leaned just a little closer, not much, but enough to show her guard was lowering. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if afraid to hear it herself. "I hate the letter D too. D is for damage, for don't happen." Lucien looked up at her, saying nothing. But in that silence, something was acknowledged. That night, in the quiet of her small room, Eleanor sat by the window with the ointment Lucien had left behind. She opened it, breathed in the scent of mint. No more doubt, no more defenses. She applied it to the bruise, with her own hands, not because no one else would help, but because for the first time she believed she was worth the care, even if it came from herself. Late afternoon, the kitchen smelled faintly of scorched shallots and melting butter. Maggie was stacking the freshly washed dishes. Elena helped dry them, a silent routine they had never discussed, but which had settled into habit. Elena's hands were thin and still weak, but her movements were steady, patient. "That little girl, Lily, used to stop by on Tuesdays for savory scones," Maggie said without thinking. "Didn't see her last week. Maybe the snow kept her in." Eleanor paused slightly but didn't ask. She knew the name. Not sure from where, but it carried a trail of hazy memories behind it. Maggie placed the last spoon in the tray, draped a cloth over it, then sat at the writing desk. It was an old habit. Once a week, she wrote a letter by hand to Maribel Ruiz, the bakery owner down in town, an old friend, a woman who had once been a safe harbor for many lost souls. She picked up the pen and began. "Maribel, the snow this week wasn't as thick as we thought, but thick enough that anyone not ready to face the world stayed indoors." She paused, glanced at Elena hanging tea towels out on the porch. "There's someone new in my house. Not a guest. Not someone I know. A young woman. Her name is Elena. She was beaten. Left in the woods. The boy brought her home like someone picks up a crumpled paper blown in by the wind. I didn't ask too much, but I can tell her wounds aren't just on the outside. They're the kind we women, you and I, have both carried, at least once in our lives. She folded the letter. No sigh, no lingering sorrow, just placed the envelope on the table beside a bundle of dry biscuits she had wrapped herself. That evening, Eleanor sat in the small living room, a book on her lap. Her fingers traced the frayed spine. The firelight cast a soft glow on her face, revealing the sun-worn skin and a thin scar along her left wrist. The same scar Lucienne had noticed 2 days ago, but hadn't mentioned yet. Lucienne walked in. He seemed about to say something, then stopped. Instead, he looked at her, then spoke quietly. I've seen a scar like that before. On my little girl's wrist. She fell once, learning to ride her bike. Eleanor froze. She didn't pull her hand away, but her eyes lingered in the space between them before turning to meet his. There was no pity in his look, no probing, only patience, just enough for her to breathe. Lucienne continued, gently. If you're ready, would you tell me about it? About that scar? Elena looked down. Her hand trembled slightly. She touched her wrist, not to hide it, but as if weighing whether she could open the door to what lay behind it. The first time, it was because I didn't smile the right way. Her voice was low, like she was telling someone else's story. She said I smiled wrong. I had to relearn everything. How to look, how to speak, how to enter a room, even how to sit like a grateful girl. If I didn't do it right, she had ways of making sure I'd remember. She looked at her hands. Her fingers curled unconsciously. She called it training, but all I knew was fear. Lucian sat still, his hand clenched on his knee. They called her Judith, a kind woman, they said, took in lost girls. Even my father believed her. He signed the papers, thought I'd be safe. She paused, a quiet breath escaping. No one ever thinks a place with that many praises could be hell. Lucienne nodded silently. Inside his chest, something stirred, not gently. Eleanor went on, her voice now caught in a current too strong to stop. Every time I resisted, they sent me to the basement. No light. Just one dim bulb and the echo of laughter from the men she called investors. The obedient ones got nice food, pretty clothes. The rest lost their names. I was once called by a number. Lucian still didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel small. But his eyes said enough. He believed her. He was on her side. After a while, Lucienne spoke again, his voice still low, but now with something more, resolve. Elena, if you can tell me this, you can tell a courtroom. Have you ever thought about bringing this into the light? Eleanor was silent. Her hand tightened around the now cold teacup. She didn't look at him, just gave a soft shake of her head. I don't know if I'm strong enough. I'm still scared. What if they don't believe me? Lucienne didn't rush. He waited through a few quiet breaths, then leaned slightly forward, voice sincere. There are so many girls out there like you, still waiting, still hurting. If you speak, you won't just save yourself. You'll save them too. You won't have to fight alone. Elena looked up. Her eyes were no longer lost, but full of turbulence, fear, doubt, but also something newly lit, like a flame in the middle of a snowy night. I'll think about it, she whispered. I'll try. That morning, instead of preparing breakfast like she usually did, Mrs. Maggie quietly wrapped a wool scarf around Eleanor's neck. The fresh air will help you breathe easier, she said. her hands still busy packing dry bread and a few slices of apple into a basket. Besides, you need to see people. And so they left the wooden cabin nestled in the forest, heading down into town on the first cold morning since the snow had stopped falling. Maggie adjusted Elena's scarf, gently straightened her collar. They stood outside Maribel's bakery. Maggie's voice was soft. "Go on. She's kind. She's been hoping to meet you." Elena hesitated. It was the first time she'd left the estate to come into town. Her eyes flickered with doubt, like every door might be hiding a trap. But Maggie didn't push. She simply stood beside her, waiting for Elena to take that step on her own. At last, Elena reached out and gently pushed open the wooden door. The bell above the entrance chimed. She stepped inside, slight, quiet, wrapped in that familiar scarf. Her eyes swept the room as if searching for something unnamed. Maribel, placing a tray of pastries on the shelf, said nothing. She just took a still warm almond tart, wrapped it neatly in parchment paper. "For you," she said, her voice low but steady. Elena took it, uncertain. "I don't. It's okay. I know about you," Maribel cut in, her voice lowering, her eyes resting on the scarf around Elena's neck. "I know, because I saw it too, years ago. I stayed quiet back then, pretended not to notice. I knew you were with Maggie. The moment she wrote me, I had a feeling. I kept silent for so long. That was the biggest mistake of my life." Elena lowered her gaze. Her face showed a flicker of surprise, as if something Maribel said had stirred a part of her she'd spent years burying. But there was fear, too, in her eyes. A fear that if she spoke, it would all collapse. That no one would believe her. That no one would stand beside her. Her fingers gripped the parchment around the pastry, like she was holding on to something slipping from her hands. She didn't look up, but she didn't turn away either. As if in that quiet moment, someone had just offered her a chance. Small, but real. That afternoon, Sheriff Tom Halley, who had served this town for over 30 years, happened to step into the bakery just as Elena and Maggie slipped out the back. The door was still gently swinging, a trace of cold wind brushing past the hem of Elena's skirt. Tom entered, hat dusted from the road, his thick coat still holding the chill. His eyes swept the bakery. It still smelled of butter and cinnamon like always, but something felt different. Maribel Ruiz was returning a tray to the shelf, glancing toward the door before turning to him. "Black coffee. No sugar?" she asked, already reaching for the white ceramic cup. Tom nodded, pulling out a chair. Before he could speak, Maribel's voice came, gentle, as if the words had been waiting a long time. "I saw her again. Elena, I think she might be the one who can help you reopen that case." Tom looked up. His gaze sharpened. Maribel poured the coffee, her tone steady, like telling a story that didn't belong to her, yet had never left her mind. She hasn't said much, but I saw it in her eyes. What I've seen in so many girls who passed through my life unnoticed. There's something there that won't let me stay silent any longer. Tom's hand tightened around the coffee cup. A pause settled in. Then Maribel bent down, pulled a faded invoice from the bottom shelf, and placed it on the counter. "You remember this name, don't you? Nora Levens. She used to work for Judith Ward." Tom took the paper. His eyes narrowed. The past hit him like a cold wind blown straight into memory. 2 years ago, I saw that name in a case file. Investigation was shut down quickly. A few anonymous complaints. One handwritten letter. Something's wrong in that house. But no one stepped forward. No one dared. He set the invoice down, exhaled slowly. His face bore the quiet weight of someone who had once missed something that mattered. Maribel nodded, her hand tightening on the edge of her apron. "I'm not sure how much I can help, but I do know one thing. I'm not staying silent ever again." Outside, snow had begun to fall again, and in the rising steam of hot coffee, the baker and the sheriff exchanged a long look. One holding pastries, the other the law. Both understanding. Some truths, if not dug up today, would be buried forever. Tom didn't answer right away, but as he glanced toward the back door, where Elena had vanished, his eyes hardened slightly. There was something unspoken there, but whatever surrounded that girl, it demanded attention. He stayed a few more minutes, then stood slowly, like someone weighing something heavier than duty. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up. The sky hung grey and still, as if holding back rain. In a small cafe on the corner, 3 women in fur coats, who met weekly for their elegant tea, sat clustered by the window. They weren't close friends, but they shared a favorite hobby, knowing other people's business before those people did. Today's buzz came courtesy of Mrs. Catherine, who'd happened to walk past Maribel's and caught a glimpse of Maggie guiding a strange girl out the back, shaky, head covered, but her eyes familiar. "I heard she was sent to an institution once," Mrs. Catherine whispered first, barely containing her intrigue. "I heard she came back to cling to Grayson. Typical messy woman," the second one added, with a smug sip. "Or maybe she's really crazy. Girls like that. They're prone to doing something stupid," the last chimed in. None of them bothered to confirm her name. Rumors had already traveled faster than truth ever could. All 3 giggled quietly, as if they'd just stirred poison into their tea. Sweet, smooth poison they swallowed every week. Down the quiet street, Elena walked slowly past the village market. Her eyes avoided the faces she passed, but her ears caught the whispers, no one looking directly at her, yet everyone pretending not to notice. Where are you listening to this story? If you are lying in bed, comment bed. If you are sitting on the sofa, type glass midday. Tom returned to the office. A stack of unresolved case files lay waiting on his desk, but he didn't spare them a glance. His eyes landed instead on a small receipt, the one Maribel had handed him. The name Jake pulled at something in his memory. A previous investigation involving unregistered transport routes going up to the northern camp. That area had once been linked to several troubling incidents. Tom reached for the phone, ready to call Jake, then stopped himself. He needed more than a hunch. Something told him this wasn't just small-town gossip. A knock broke the silence. Tom looked up. Lucian Grayson stood in the doorway. No appointment, wrapped in a heavy knit coat, eyes sharp and cold. "Sheriff Halley?" Lucian spoke first. "I'm Lucian Grayson. I believe you know, I was the one who brought that girl, Elena, back home." Tom nodded, gestured for him to sit. Lucien didn't waste time. He sat down, but didn't lean back. His whole posture was taut, as if strung too tight. "She told me a few things about her stepmother, Judith. Not much, but enough to know something's been wrong for a long time. I need to ask, has that name ever come up in any of your investigations?" Tom paused, then pulled open a drawer. He took out an old file. "We had a few anonymous complaints 2 years ago. Nothing stuck. Names were redacted due to lack of evidence. But if you're asking..." He flipped through the pages, his finger pausing on one entry. Judith Ward, suspected involvement in fraudulent marriages and disappearances. Next to her name were 2 others, Clive Morgan, her private attorney, and James Deacon, owner of the Northern Camp. The case had been opened, then quietly closed. There hadn't been enough witness testimony, no hard proof. Some who had come forward later retracted their statements, most likely under pressure. And at the time, town officials, many with ties to Judith, leaned heavily against further inquiry. Tom exhaled, then added, She took in young girls, orphans, kids from broken homes, said she was helping them, giving them a future. And on paper, everything checked out: scholarships, counseling, housing. But after a while, most of the girls disappeared. Some were married off to older, wealthy men, many of whom had prior allegations of abuse. Elena might be one of the few who stayed too long or fought back. The room thickened with tension. Tom turned the page, scribbled a few notes. After Lucienne left the station, Tom sent a deputy to confirm transport logs. It was the deputy who met Jake, the horse-drawn wagon driver, and confirmed that a young woman had traveled alone that day to the northern camp. Everything was documented. That same afternoon, Lucienne received a call from an unknown number. A woman's voice, trembling but steady, came through. "Lucienne?" "It's me, Lucia." Lucienne froze. The name pulled him back to childhood, a faint, blurry memory of a distant cousin who once lived with his family for a few years, before vanishing without a word. "I heard about the girl you saved, Eleanor. Is she one of Judith's foster girls?" Lucienne paused, then answered, "Yes." "Then I need to see you. There's something I need to tell you. And if you're really trying to bring the truth to light, maybe I can help." The next evening, at an upscale cafe downtown, Lucienne sat across from Lucia. She was still beautiful in a quiet, weathered way, but something behind her eyes had broken a long time ago. "I lived there," she began, without hesitation. "Judith took me in for 3 years while my parents worked in Europe. She never hit me, but she used something else: guilt." Lucian cradled his coffee cup, but didn't drink. He watched every small movement of his cousin. "She made me report everything: letters, diaries, even dreams. Anyone who resisted was labeled ungrateful, broken. I was thrown out one night in the rain because I refused to bring a classmate to meet her." Lucienne noticed the faint scar behind Lucia's ear, something he'd seen before, but never questioned. Now, he didn't need to. "Why now?" he asked gently. Lucia met his gaze, unwavering. "Because I heard Eleanor's story, and I realized if I stay silent any longer, I'm no better than the ones who stood by. And because I believe you won't turn away from the truth." Lucian nodded, his chest tightening. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, another person ready to stand on the side of justice, even if it meant digging through her own pain. Hours before the city's annual charity gala, Sheriff Tom sent word: Judith Ward would be attending. The event, a glittering facade of philanthropy, was infamous for the deals whispered behind champagne glasses. Lucienne hadn't planned on going, but the file lay open in front of him, filled with names of those who'd taken brides from Judith. And Elena's words from the day before echoed in his mind. "They didn't just hurt me." He put on his coat. No driver this time. He wasn't going there to confront. Not yet. He needed to see her, to look into the eyes of the woman who had lived behind lies for so long. To make sure he wasn't wrong about Eleanor. Lucian entered the ballroom. He didn't approach her, but across the sea of people, their eyes met. Judith froze. Her smile stayed, but her hand clenched subtly around her wine glass. Neither spoke. But in that silence, something was declared. Meanwhile, in a small bar near the miners' quarters, Samuel Ward, Elena's father, sat alone. The whiskey bottle in front of him was nearly empty. "What did I do?" "To my daughter." His voice cracked, eyes red, the words barely escaping his throat. The bartender refilled his glass without a word. Samuel slumped over the table. No one in the bar knew the story, but they all looked away, as if remorse was something that could spread just by meeting your eyes. That night, under a moonless sky, the wheels of justice began to turn, quietly, but without pause. The very next morning, Sheriff Tom summoned his two most trusted deputies into his office. With the information Lucien had shared and the old files he had unearthed, Tom knew he could no longer afford to wait. "We need to start with the two most suspicious names," he said quietly, placing two folders on the desk. Clive Morgan, James Deacon. Clive Morgan had long served as Judith Ward's personal attorney. For years, he handled her civil affairs, adoption paperwork, private settlements, and discreet contracts with struggling families. There had once been allegations, never proven, that Clive had forged documents to legitimize Judith's staged marriages. But without a witness willing to speak, the case had faded into silence, buried in the archives like a forgotten sin. James Deacon, by contrast, was the owner of a large farm in the remote northern outskirts of town. Few people ventured there. It had long been rumored that the farm served as a kind of training ground for young women sent by Judith's charitable organizations, girls who were promised a future, a skill, a chance. But none of them ever came back to the village, and no one ever asked why. One deputy was sent to Clive Morgan's office under the pretense of a routine audit of legal records. The other headed north to Deacon's farm, carrying a court order to inspect the staff registry and labor records under state employment law. Sheriff Tom made no public announcement. He knew one wrong move, one loose word, could make every piece of evidence vanish. But he also knew this: if he didn't act now, there would be more girls like Elena, erased quietly from the world. And no one would dare ask why. That same morning, he filed a request to reopen the Judith Ward case on the grounds that a new witness had come forward, ready to speak. Meanwhile, in a small room behind an old chapel on the edge of town, Father Raphael sat in silence. He had once led the Sunday services at the ancient stone church Judith Ward often donated to. The wooden crucifix still hung where it always had, but something inside him had shifted. On the worn desk before him lay a battered notebook. He opened it with trembling fingers, flipping to a page yellowed by time. The note, hastily scribbled, read, "Eleanor Ward, requested shelter, injured, cause unknown." Judith picked her up later. It was the only time the girl had come to him. She had worn a torn coat, her eyes swollen, her voice silent. She only asked for one night's sleep in the back room. But less than an hour later, Judith had arrived, with two private officers in tow. She told him Elena was suffering from a psychotic episode, family history. Father Raphael hadn't believed her. But fear had held him back. Fear of trouble. Fear of losing Judith's monthly donations to the church. "Dear Lord," he whispered now, his voice breaking, "if you grant me one more chance, let me make it right." At that same moment, down the dim corridor of a worn-down hospital, a nurse named Carla was digging through the electronic archives. Her screen blinked to life, displaying a patient record. Elena Ward, diagnosis, acute psychosis. Beneath it, the faint signature of Dr. Langston. Carla stared at the screen, unmoving. She remembered that night, nearly a year ago, when Judith walked into the nurse's station, placed a thick envelope on the desk, and said, "Write exactly what I say. She's unstable. She needs urgent psychiatric care." Carla had written the report and never asked questions. Now, she tore a printed copy of that old report from the machine and slipped it into her pocket. "I won't look away again," she murmured. Then she stood and left the archive room, her footsteps fast, purposeful. Elsewhere, in a small living room bathed in quiet morning light, Elena stood in front of a mirror. She brushed her hair gently, not to erase the past, but to see herself more clearly. There had been a time when she no longer knew who she was, when her reflection felt like a stranger. But now, people, strangers, were beginning to speak for her, and in their voices she was starting to hear her own. She took a breath. This time she would speak, and she would not be afraid. A misty morning cloaked the town as the city hall opened earlier than usual. Outside, villagers began to gather, some curious, others quietly supportive. The national flag fluttered weakly in the cold wind, like an old witness who no longer believed in justice, but remained standing anyway. Elena sat alone in the small waiting room behind the courtroom. Maggie rested a hand on her shoulder, saying nothing, but offering more comfort than words ever could. Lucien stood silently in the corner, arms crossed, eyes never leaving Elena. He knew that if she even looked his way, he'd come to her. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. She had never imagined this day would come, the day she'd have to recount every lash, every step in that dark hallway. But this trial wasn't just for her. It was for all the girls who no longer had the strength to stand. Footsteps echoed. The door creaked open. The trial of Judith Ward will now commence. Eleanor stepped up to the witness stand. The room was so silent she could hear the pounding of her own heart. Judith sat below, calm, poised, like she was attending a luxury press conference. A thin smile curled on her lips, controlled, deliberate, as if everything was going exactly according to plan. Behind her, Lucien sat beside Sheriff Tom. Both men looked exhausted. They had spent the past week knocking on doors, one by one, trying to convince people to come forward. The first to agree was Maribel Ruiz. One late evening, she slipped a folded letter into Sheriff Tom's hand. At the bottom, a single line. "I was silent once. I won't be silent again." Then came Lucia, Lucien's cousin. She refused twice before finally nodding. Lucien never pushed. He just told stories about Elena, about Lily, about the forgotten names. Lucia cried. Then she said yes. Father Raphael came to Tom's house just before midnight. His hands trembled as he held out a torn page from the parish registry. Elena Ward, seeking refuge. He had turned her away once. Now he wanted to be the one to open the door again. Carla, the hospital nurse, walked in quietly, holding a file of erased medical records. "I signed something I didn't believe in," she said. "Today, I want to take that signature back." One by one, they took the stand. Lucia, Maribel, Father Raphael, Carla, each like a shard of truth dug up from the grave. And then came Eleanor. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't shaking, but it was deep, cutting. She spoke of the basement, the chords, the girls whose names she never knew. Each word she spoke was like a blade slicing through the veil of morality Judith had worn for years. Then, a quiet moment. A small figure dashed up from the back rows, Lily, the girl Elena had once taught to read. She handed a folded letter to Judge Carter with both hands. "Miss Elena taught me ABC," it read. "But my favorite is E. E is for Elena. E is for I exist. I know she's a good person. I love her. She said if we see someone hurting, we should speak up. I see her hurting, so I speak." Judge Carter, once rumored to be biased, fell silent. His voice lowered as he read the letter. His face was unreadable, but his eyes seemed to search for something beyond crime, something closer to conscience. And just when it felt like truth might finally prevail, Judith Ward's defense attorney rose to his feet. Seasoned, sharp, unshaken. "Your Honor," he began, voice smooth as steel, "we are here judging a woman's life based on emotion. No recordings, no photos, no direct witnesses to the alleged acts. Every testimony is a memory, stretched over years. And my client, Mrs. Judith Ward, is a woman of prestige, a figure who has aided hundreds of women across the state. Her honor should not be traded for tears. The room sank into silence. The witnesses lowered their heads. Some gripped each other's hands. Judith smiled, thin as a razor, timed like every press briefing she'd ever held. She sat tall, hands neatly folded, eyes locked on the judge. In that moment, she reclaimed control, as if everything before had been nothing more than theater. Sheriff Tom wiped his brow. Sweat seeped through the rim of his hat. Lucien clenched his fists, his eyes fixed ahead. Every witness had spoken. But there was no physical evidence, no signed confession, no clear images, no video or audio recordings that could outweigh doubt. And Judith knew that. She said nothing. But her eyes spoke clearly. Once again, "You can't touch me." And she was winning. The courtroom door swung open. Every head turned. A woman stepped inside, thin, with her hair neatly tied at the nape of her neck, wearing a worn beige coat. In her arms, she held a folder and a small USB drive. Her face was pale, drained of color by fear, but her voice, though slightly trembling, carried a quiet strength. "I have evidence." The room fell silent, as if holding its breath. From the attorney's bench, her name was spoken aloud. Nora Levens. Time seemed to pause. Nora Levens, the former personal assistant to Judith. For nearly 6 years, she had lived in the woman's mansion, arranging her charity work, managing the rotation of young girls who came and went under the guise of goodwill. But then, one night, 2 years ago, Nora disappeared. Rumors claimed she'd had a breakdown. Some said she'd moved away. No one knew the truth, except one person who never believed she left by choice. Lucien Grayson. The night before the trial, Lucien had quietly left the estate. In his coat pocket was a small slip of paper handed to him by Sheriff Tom, a man who once served under Judith, now disillusioned. The note bore an old name, a location. 70 miles out, hidden deep in a forested stretch beyond town, Lucien arrived at a run-down rental cabin. The door creaked open. A woman peeked through, her eyes hollow, stripped of hope. "Who are you?" she asked warily. Lucien didn't answer. Instead, he pulled from his coat a pale grey woolen scarf, Elena's scarf. It still carried a smear of dried blood. His voice was low, steady. "She's still alive? But she can't stand on her own?" Nora moved to shut the door. He caught the handle, not to force, not to threaten, just to hold. His gaze met hers, direct, unflinching. "How long has it been since you slept through the night?" Such a simple question. But it broke her. Inside the damp, time-worn cabin, with the ticking of a broken clock echoing like a heartbeat out of sync, she told her story. Judith had fired her without warning after Nora refused to sign a falsified report, a psychiatric diagnosis labeling one of the girls as delusional. Carla, the house nurse, had also been pressured to sign. That night, Nora was thrown out, threatened into silence. And now, she was back. Nora handed over the USB, a video file showing Judith slapping a brown-haired girl and threatening her. A male voice could be heard saying, "We already paid." Following that were scanned copies of confidential agreements bearing Judith's signature, donation records, and handwritten notes in the margins. "Send her tomorrow night. Avoid the main checkpoint." Judge Carter gripped the arms of his chair tightly. Behind him, the screen flickered to life. Judith's face appeared, cold, unrecognizable. No longer the poised philanthropist, but a woman stripped of masks, exposed as a systematic manipulator. The courtroom was stone still. Lucien exhaled slowly, eyes closed. He had placed his faith in someone deeply wounded, and she had not let him down. Judith said nothing, but this time her silence was not a weapon. It was the sound of a crumbling wall. Just as the judge raised his gavel to call a recess, another voice broke the quiet. I need to say something." It was Eleanor. Her hands shook, but her voice did not. She stepped forward into the center of the room, her eyes meeting each face one by one. "I was the last girl to live in that house, but I wasn't the only one. There were others. Some are dead. Some vanished. No one believed them. They were called liars, called crazy. But no one ever asked, why would a girl with a future suddenly disappear without a trace?" She paused, turning toward Judith, now visibly pale, fingers trembling, but still clinging to the facade of control. "I don't want anyone to have to stand here after me. I speak because they no longer can. I stand for those who once stood in silence, just like I did." The judge said nothing. No one needed to. The tide had turned. Outside, the cold wind that had haunted this trial for days no longer felt so bitter. And for the first time in years, justice wasn't traded for reputation. A light snow had dusted the courthouse steps that morning, and sunlight broke gently through the mist like a quiet blessing from the sky. The flag stirred faintly in the wind. The courtroom doors opened, and everyone rose. In that instant, all eyes turned toward the judge. No more murmurs, no more whispers, only the thudding of hearts, heavy and waiting. Judge Carter held the verdict in both hands. He looked toward the witness stand, where Elena sat, her eyes still red from her final testimony. He looked at Nora, head bowed, eyes filled with shame, yet courage flickered in her stillness. And then at Judith, the woman whose chin remained high, though her fingers had begun to twitch involuntarily, a tremor betraying the crack beneath her control. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but every word landed like the final strike of a gavel. Judith Ward, charged with human trafficking, falsifying medical records, and complicity in a series of human rights violations, sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. No one exhaled, no applause, only a quiet sob, perhaps from Lucia or Carla. Elena did not blink. Judith lifted her head, her lips pressed into a tight line. Her eyes scanned the room, searching, desperately, for a familiar gaze. A friend, an ally, someone who still believed her. But the room where she once stood so confidently, preaching charity and goodwill, now met her with nothing but quiet, unwavering stares. No one returned her final glance. Sheriff Tom stood, giving a small nod to the two deputies. They approached, placing cuffs on Judith's wrists with motions that were both professional and weighty. She didn't resist, but her lips trembled, not from the cold, but because, for the first time, she no longer controlled the narrative. Lucien remained seated, but within him, something slowly released. Not triumph, but closure. An end to something that had long left him helpless. Nora lowered her head. She didn't cry, but her hands gripped each other tightly beneath her knees. Perhaps now, she would sleep through the night, undisturbed. Elena turned her face away, not out of avoidance, but to preserve a sliver of privacy. For the moment her wounds began, finally, to close. Out in the courthouse corridor, Samuel Ward, the silver-haired man with lost eyes, waited for her. When Elena stepped out, he approached. He didn't touch her. He only removed his old wool cap. "I'm sorry. I should have protected you, when I still had the chance." Elena froze. The man before her, the father who once held her close through sleepless nights after her mother's death, now stood like a stranger. Years ago, when his wife passed, Samuel collapsed inward, and Judith, with her sweet smile and cold eyes, walked into their lives. Desperate for something to cling to, Samuel gave her everything: his finances, his name, his trust, and his daughter. When Elena first resisted, refusing an arranged marriage to a man 20 years older, Samuel had said nothing. And that silence was Judith's green light to send her to a reform center that was, in truth, a front for trafficking women. Elena looked at him. A long silence, longer than the years she spent trapped in fear, hung between them. But in her eyes, there was no rage left, only the hollow quiet of a child who waited to be protected, and never was. I know. No embrace, no tears, but also no hatred. He nodded once and turned away, his figure folding into the soft fall of the first snow. Elsewhere, Sheriff Tom handed 2 more warrants to his deputies, one for Clive Morgan, the attorney who had enabled Judith's crimes, and another for Mayor Ford, the man who had buried the truth for years. "No one stands above the law," Tom said quietly. At that very moment, atop the hill behind the Grayson estate, Lucien and Elena sat side by side. Before them, the forest was slowly waking from frost. The first green tips of pine broke through the frozen earth. "I don't want to leave anymore," she whispered, "because not every place has someone who stops, for someone who forgot how to be themselves." Lucien didn't answer. He simply held her hand, not to keep her, but to walk with her. Eleanor looked up, the trees, the smoke from chimneys, the sky painted in shades of dusk. Nothing had changed. And yet inside her, something stirred. For the first time, she saw this place for what it could be: a home, not a hiding place, not just shelter with a lock, but a space where her breathing didn't need to be small, where silence wasn't dangerous, but peaceful, where the air didn't carry fear, only the scent of warmth and something beginning. In the center of town, the bakery windows glowed with golden light. Inside, Maggie sat beside Maribel and 2 village women, their heads bowed over yards of simple white cloth. The fabric wasn't new, it wasn't fancy, but their hands moved with reverence, each stitch done slowly, as if honoring something no one dared name aloud. "This isn't just a dress," Maggie said softly, not lifting her eyes. "It's a quiet kind of promise." Maribel nodded, her fingers smoothing the fabric with the same care she gave her bread. "It's what she'll wear when she finally steps into the life she's built, not the one she ran from." Clara, the youngest of them, embroidered a row of tiny white wildflowers along the hem, not because it would be seen, but because it would be felt. They didn't speak much after that. The sewing became a kind of prayer, a tribute to the women they once were, and the women they refused to let be forgotten. By sunset, the dress hung near the window, lit by soft amber light. It swayed gently, catching the scent of fresh orange buns and warm sugar. Not perfect, but real and ready. The day of the wedding, Elena stood at the mirror. She touched the fabric of the dress, the seams so lovingly sewn, the embroidery so quietly powerful. There was no veil, no jewelry, just her, and a dress made from the belief of people who'd stayed. For the first time, when she looked at her reflection, she didn't search for proof that she belonged. She simply did. That evening, the house settled into stillness. Lucien sat beside her, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The silence was full, not of fear, but of peace. Elena looked around the room, the soft lamplight, the worn wood, the faint sound of snow falling again. Everything looked the same, but she had changed. "I never thought I'd be the one who stayed," she whispered. Lucien didn't answer immediately. Then, with the same quiet steadiness that had carried them here, He replied, "You didn't stay. You rebuilt." Maribel placed a wedding cake on the table, almond and orange marmalade filling, topped with sugar glaze as white as snow. "She didn't just survive," Maribel whispered. "She became part of us." The wind blew again, but this time the town didn't shudder. Elena had chosen to stay, and somehow life had chosen to begin again, through her. That morning, the small town woke to the sound of church bells and the warm scent of baked goods drifting from Maribel's bakery. A soft layer of snow blanketed the rooftops, but the air wasn't bitter, just crisp enough to feel like nature's quiet blessing. Down the path that led to the Grayson estate, footprints marked a careful trail across the freshly fallen snow. The townspeople, everyone from the postman to the elderly couple who lived near the edge of the woods, were dressed in their best. Some carried bouquets of wildflowers. Others held old handkerchiefs embroidered with the name Elena. They weren't there out of curiosity. They were there because they had seen it all. The backyard of the estate had been transformed with modest grace. White ribbons fluttered gently in the breeze, hand-woven wreaths hung on weathered posts, and rows of wooden chairs were arranged neatly in the snow-dusted lawn. No official invitations had been sent. They came because they had once signed their names to a petition. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a confirmation that someone once cast aside could still be chosen, could still be loved and believed in. Sheriff Tom, dressed in an old suit carefully ironed for the occasion, stood before a simple wooden podium, officiating. He cleared his throat, gripping a small weathered notebook with both hands. His eyes were tinged with red, not from the cold, but from something older and softer. Lucienne stood beside him, wearing a deep grey suit that fit just a bit too perfectly, like he hadn't planned to keep it long. His posture was strong, but his gaze shimmered faintly. This wasn't his first time standing at an altar, but it was the first time he meant forever. Music began to play, not from speakers, but from the trembling strings of an old violin held by a boy once orphaned, whom Elena had tutored when no one else would. Lily, the little girl who used to sneak into the library just to hear Eleanor's stories, walked ahead, tossing petals with her small hands. Her white dress was stained with dirt from earlier mischief, but her smile sparkled like a real snowflake. She took her seat in the front row afterward, beaming with pride, as though she herself had orchestrated the entire event. Then came Eleanor. She appeared at the edge of the clearing, her arm linked not with her father, but with Maggie, the first person who had believed she was worth saving. Her gown was simple, white, perfectly fitted, stitched with the hands of those who had chosen to believe in her when she couldn't. She walked slowly, deliberately, and she smiled, a full, steady smile, no longer hesitant, no longer afraid. The scars along her arms were visible, not hidden, kept as they were, like chapters in a story worth remembering. When she stood before Lucian, he looked into her eyes and said quietly, "I didn't save you. You saved yourself. I was just lucky enough to be there for it." Elena squeezed his hand. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was the gentlest kind of yes. The ceremony unfolded with no fanfare, no choir, no trumpets. But every glance, every hand held, carried a weight words could never hold. Sheriff Tom said a few short words, mostly blessings. No one here needed promises of forever. What mattered was the trust placed, quietly, firmly, in each other, here and now. That evening, after the guests had gone, Eleanor sat at a small wooden desk by the window, a worn fountain pen in hand. Beside her stood a handcrafted wooden mailbox, a gift from Maggie, where Eleanor would begin placing letters, written for the ones who had never been heard. She wrote, "To the girls who once stayed silent like I did, I don't know your names, but I know what it feels like to be made invisible, Speak up, not for revenge, but to reclaim the voice that was taken from you. I used mine. You can use yours. Lucien appeared quietly, placing a steaming cup of tea in front of her. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. They sat side by side, watching the woods blanketed in snow. But this time, the snow didn't feel like silence or sorrow. It felt like a soft beginning. On the window pane, the warmth from the tea and from the one sitting across her slowly melted the thin frost. A breeze passed, carrying with it the faint scent of Maribel's orange cake. She baked it every day. But today, it smelled sweeter somehow. And in their hearts, neither of them felt cold anymore. Eleanor leaned her head gently onto Lucien's shoulder. Her eyes closed, not out of weariness, but because for the first time, she allowed herself to feel at peace. Below the window, Lily was building a new snowman. She looked up, spotted them, and waved with a wide grin. Elena smiled back. It was still winter, but it wasn't cold anymore. A wedding, a beginning, a story rewritten, not with magic, but with love, trust, and truth. The story ends here, but what lingers isn't the dress or the rings. It's the courage it takes to walk into the light after years of living in shadow. Eleanor didn't win because of a miracle. She found her way back because someone believed that even the broken could rise again and live kindly. We never truly know what the woman beside us carries in her silence. Maybe she's fought to survive behind closed doors. Maybe she, too, was once an Eleanor, dismissed, diminished, almost disappeared. And if you are a woman reading this, I hope today you had a warm meal, wore something that felt like you, and was seen, truly seen, by someone without judgment. And if not, remember, someone out there still believes you are worthy. Thank you for staying until the very end. If you're hearing this at night, let this be your gentle reminder. Turn on a soft song, just low enough, for your heart to slow down and breathe again.